In this video, we'll look at how the Puritan society in the 17th century continued to change as how time passed and it began to weaken and how dissidents grew up and how these dissidents then formed dissident colonies. And we'll start with, of course, Roger Williams. He was a Puritan minister in the 1630s, described by leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony as a man, quote, godly and zealous, having many precious parts, but very unsettled in judgment, unquote. He preached the separation of church and state, as well as religious toleration. Williams worried that the government might act for ungodly reasons and hurt the religion, and that religion might in turns always lead, religion didn't always lead to good governance and such. He even had the audacity to deny the king any right to American land. He said, James has no more right to give away or sell the Indians' land than the Indians have to sell James' kingdom. The Puritans didn't give a damn about James, but William's claims, they worried, might cast doubt on the legality of their church and their government as well. The Massachusetts Bay Colony leaders ordered Williams shipped back to England, but before they could ship him out, he fled south below Massachusetts Bay Colony and founded the town of Providence with some of his followers. In Providence, he bought the land from the Indians. He negotiated the land purchase from the Indians because, again, he recognized the Indians' rights to that property. And he began to establish a colony that had some religious toleration in it. Another dissident was Anne Hutchinson. She was the wife of a respected Boston merchant in the early 1640s, but she held discussion groups among women to discuss the Sunday services. And she began to argue with what the Puritans thought about becoming one of the elect, about their so-called conversion experience. To understand Anne Hutchinson's theology and how radical it was, you have to understand that the Puritans taught a covenant of works. People would, the government, the society, the church, they could recognize who God had made one of the elect because they did a body of good works. They called it a covenant of works. And if somebody sinned or wasn't doing good works, then they clearly were not one of the saved and were not recognized by society as one of the elect. So everybody lived real strict lives, and they were gauged on what we called a covenant of works. Well, a minister came into Massachusetts Bay named John Cotton, and John Cotton had been sort of kicked out of Puritan society in England, and he come to America, and he began to question this idea of a covenant of works. He began to preach what's called a covenant of grace, the idea that, you couldn't understand God, and God may reveal to somebody that they're one of the elect, even though they didn't have a covenant of works, even though they didn't have a body of good works to demonstrate to society. And you got to, again, this is revolutionary because the entire society and government was based upon a recognition of people that were elect. And if you followed John Cotton's covenant of grace, then, you could be arguing that somebody was saved and society had no way of recognizing it. So it undermined Puritan theology and the governments all at once. Well, Anne Hutchinson was a devotee of John Cotton, and she was preaching a covenant of grace. And as I say, this was a threat to the religious and civil establishment of Massachusetts Bay, and so they banned her. They banished her. And she was a woman as well, which was a woman getting involved at that level of society, governance, and theology was considered sort of revolutionary itself. She, like Roger Williams before her, moved south of Massachusetts Bay and founded the colony of Portsmouth. In time, Williamstown and colony of Providence and Hutchinson's town and colony of Portsmouth sort of combined to form the United Colony of Rhode Island. The colony of Rhode Island maintained its toleration of all religions. It had no established church and allowed anybody free thinkers to come. Even Jewish people, who didn't have to be Christian, could come there. It's supposed to be maybe the most liberal religiously of all the original 13 colonies. By the end of the 17th century, the end of the 1600s, Massachusetts Bay Colony had a more fundamental problem than just the individual dissidents. Yeah, I've mentioned this before with regard to the Salem witch trials. You're getting the second, third, and fourth generation raised in America. They didn't have the overriding piety of the initial settlers. They'd not experienced the persecution. And this meant that it was, getting harder and harder for the Puritan elders to confirm a conversion experience by confirming the good works. But, if you're gauging on a covenant of good works, they were younger people. I mean, they're all engaging in what authorities believe was sinful behavior, and so they were denied church membership. They're not becoming one of the elect. Now, while this was going on, the colony was growing. By 1700, it had surpassed 50,000 people, but there were, relatively fewer and fewer church members or elect. And only the church members and elect could vote and hold office, and that meant fewer and fewer people had all the political power. And this is an obvious problem. It's going to lead to instability, and hell, it could lead to a potential revolution. So in 1622, the Puritans adopted what became known as the Halfway Covenant. It bestowed partial church membership on the descendants of the elect, the present membership. As they waited to be full members and thus, recognized as saved, they could be baptized and participate in church affairs and even have their own children baptized. The Halfway Covenant altered Calvinist theology by making salvation, in essence, more predictable. These halfway members would inevitably be more likely to continue to try to show good works and thus become full members of the church. What it meant was the Puritans were in effort seeing themselves as more of a chosen people by blood, not simply by acts of good works. It, of course, also assured the Puritan and elect control of the church and the government. A number of congregations fought the Halfway Covenant for years, believing that it was not in God's will to water down the requirements. But the Halfway Covenant didn't succeed. And, it shows you that by the end of the 17th century, the theology was beginning to break down. You can see this religious fervor of the Puritans beginning to weaken in the college they established. In 1836, the strict Puritans established Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Boston. The school was established to train Puritan ministers. The school is named after John Harvard, who had donated some money in his library of 400 books in 1639. Like all the Puritan organizations, it was very strict. Its motto was Truth for Christ and the Church. 10 of its first 12 presidents were very strict Puritan ministers. By the early 1700s, new leadership decided to remove Harvard from such direct control of the Puritans. Harvard now had a big endowment and lots of property, and new Harvard leaders sort of revised their curriculum, making it more loose and more theologically liberal. A lot of the old conservative Puritans complained, but they then decided to open a new school that would keep the strict Puritan traditions, and they chose New Haven, Connecticut for its location. The new university became known as Yale College, named after a Boston businessman named Elihu Yale, who donated money for a new building. Unfortunately for the strict Puritan leaders, Yale too soon became more liberal theologically, and these strict old Puritan leaders couldn't stop the changes sweeping across their religion. In fact, by the 1700s, you begin to see that the strict Puritan theology of the first Puritans was, it's kind of gone. And by that time, there was so much diversity. The only thing that most of these, these covenants of God that these communities had established in Massachusetts and in surrounding areas, now known as New England, the only thing they had in common was their sense of community and covenant. The word we use to describe these churches is the Congregationalist churches. It was really more a movement than a single theological belief or denominations. They had a number of different theological views, but the key principle that united them was they They all believed that the individual formed a personal relationship with God. They still rejected the rituals and hierarchy of the churches like the Catholic and Anglican churches had it. And people would still get together and develop their own covenant agreement with God that they would follow. But a lot of their theology was a lot more liberal. The predestination wasn't stressed as much, of the idea of the elect. And, some still believed in predestination as the original Puritans. But more and more of these Congregationalist churches accepted that all people could be saved. So again, you're seeing the original Puritan theology weaken. As Congregationalism grew and the Puritan theology began to break apart, of course, Massachusetts Bay was still growing and more towns were outside its boundary. And eventually they ended up forming two new colonies, Connecticut and New Hampshire. They weren't really as much a dissident religious colony as like Rhode Island was, but they didn't share the harsh early puritanical beliefs of Massachusetts Bay. Interesting with Connecticut, Connecticut wrote down its governance, and they called it the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and it's often regarded as the first real sort of written constitution in America, if you don't count the Mayflower Compact as a constitution. But this was a direct set of written down laws. In any event, this concludes the video on sort of the changing of the Puritan faith in the 17th century and the dissident colonies that are formed from it.